Sometimes the strongest warriors don't wear medals. They wear scars, silent ones etched into their hearts, and walk with old dogs by their side. Tom Granger, a 72-year-old Marine veteran, doesn't ask for much. Just a place to sit in the sun, a memory to share with the one friend who never left his side. Sergeant, a graying Labrador who once sniffed out death on the battlefields of Fallujah. To strangers, Tom might seem like just another lonely old man talking to his dog. But what they don't see is a lifetime of loyalty, a bond forged in war and kept alive in peace, no matter how cold the world became around them. One viral video, mocking him, almost erased that quiet dignity. But what followed was something no one expected. A powerful reminder that true honor never fades, and that loyalty, once earned, echoes far beyond the battlefield. What unfolded next would move a nation and prove that even in silence, love and courage still speak loudest. Real people don't salute dogs, you crazy old man. Tom Granger didn't flinch. He sat completely still on the weathered park bench, his gnarled hand gently resting on the bony head of Sergeant, the old dog curled quietly in his lap. The dog's breathing was soft, steady, each rise and fall of his chest a fragile whisper of the life they'd shared. Laughter rang out across the open lawn. It was sharp, mocking. A cluster of teenagers stood several yards away, their phones raised and recording, sneering at the sight of the old man caressing a bone like it was sacred. But Tom didn't speak. He didn't move. He just kept stroking Sergeant's head, his eyes distant, lost in memories stitched with wet and gunfire. Hours passed. The sun dipped low behind the trees and the laughter faded. Then, without warning, a sleek black SUV rolled up near the curb, its engine barely a murmur. The doors opened silently. 5 Marines stepped out, every one of them in full dress blues, ribbons polished, shoes gleaming, posture rigid with purpose. They moved toward Tom and Sergeant with no hesitation, their formation tight and precise. And then, in one fluid motion, they stopped in front of the bench and raised their hands in perfect unison. Not to the gathering crowd, not to the cameras that had started recording again, but to Tom and Sergeant. Their salute was solemn, wordless, pure. It wasn't a performance, it was a recognition of a pain that not even the ravages of time or the cruelty of strangers could break. Tom Granger had never liked being called a hero. At 72, the word felt clunky, too big, too distant, too proud. He saw himself as nothing more than a man who had done what needed to be done. Back in Fallujah, where the air itself felt hostile and every shattered window could hide death, survival had meant relying on something deeper than training. It had meant trust. But Tom's survival hadn't come from instinct alone. It had come from a bond forged in silence and blood, with a creature many dismissed as just a dog. Sergeant, that was his name. A strong, solid Labrador retriever with eyes that seemed to pierce the dark, to sense danger before any human could. He wasn't just trained, he was gifted. His job was to sniff out IEDs, the deadly hidden bombs that turned dusty alleys into death traps. And he was good at it. No, he was extraordinary. He didn't just accompany Tom into combat. He watched his back. He kept him alive. He was, in every true and sacred sense, a fellow soldier. There was one night Tom would never forget, no matter how many others blurred with time. They'd been clearing a narrow alley on the outskirts of the city. It was dark, quiet, too quiet. Sergeant, always calm, always methodical, suddenly stopped mid-stride. His ears twitched. His nose flared as he sniffed the dust-laced air. And then, so slowly it was almost imperceptible, he turned and pressed himself against Tom's leg. That was the signal. Tom's hand had shot up. The patrol froze. Minutes later, the bomb tech found them. A web of explosives, crudely wired and half-buried, ready to turn them all into statistics. If Sergeant hadn't caught the scent, hadn't warned them, they would have been vapor. Their names added to a growing list no one wanted to speak aloud. In war, ammunition runs out. Food runs short. Morale cracks. But trust, that was the currency that kept you breathing. Tom trusted Sergeant with his life, and all Sergeant ever asked in return was a scratch behind the ears, a kind word, and the quiet comfort of knowing someone would be there for him too. When the war finally ended, a new kind of fight began. One Tom hadn't expected. The government had rules, rigid ones. Military working dogs were classified as assets, tools, property. They didn't go home with handlers. They were either reassigned or retired into high-security kennels. But Tom couldn't do it, couldn't walk away. Not from him, not from Sergeant, not after everything. They'd bled together, broken together, survived together. And Tom wasn't about to leave him behind like some forgotten gear tossed into storage. So began the battle. Paperwork stacked higher than his dining table. Endless calls to former commanders, most of whom barely remembered his name. Letters sent to bureaucrats and generals alike. He knocked on doors until his knuckles bled, called in every favor he'd ever earned. Some nights when the fight felt especially cruel, Tom would sit alone on his porch, Sergeant's empty leash looped loosely in his hand, and wonder if the promises men made under fire meant anything in the quiet of peacetime. Nearly a year later, the answer came. Approval. Sergeant would be released into Tom's care. The victory didn't come with trumpets or flags. But the day Tom walked into that military kennel and called his name, Sergeant's ears lifted, his eyes lit up, and his old legs scrambled forward with the urgency of a puppy. Tom knew he'd won something no medal could ever represent. Sergeant wasn't just a dog, he was a brother, a comrade, a piece of Tom's soul-made flesh. And Tom swore with the same fierce loyalty that had carried him through the war that he would spend every remaining day honoring that bond. The same determination that had once carried Tom Granger through a war, a determination forged in heat, fear, and loyalty, now guided his every step. It was a promise he had made long ago, one not spoken but written in fire, blood, sweat, and grit. They had survived together once, he and Sergeant, side by side in a far-off desert. Now, decades later, they were still together, not on battlefields of sand and gunfire, but in the slow, quiet war of aging. Some vows are born from chaos and pain, and some of them are never meant to be broken. It was meant to be just another ordinary morning. The sun hung low over the small town park, casting sleepy golden rays over weather-worn benches and narrow, cracked walking paths. Light filtered through the trees, painting slow-moving shadows that danced along the grass. Tom eased down onto the bench they always used, the one tucked beneath the old sycamore, where the breeze rustled the leaves like whispered memories. At his feet, Sergeant curled up in silence, his graying muzzle resting against Tom's leg like it belonged there, like it always had. The world moved on around them, fast and distracted. Joggers passed by, lost in music and breath. Parents corralled squealing toddlers with half-laughed warnings. Couples drifted through with to-go cups and quiet arguments. But Tom sat apart from it all, a still figure in a moving world. He ran a hand over Sergeant's thinning coat, and his voice, barely more than a murmur, slipped into the air. He spoke to the dog like you'd speak to someone who'd saved your life, not in grand declarations, but in the way old friends do, soft, slow, full of pauses and the weight of things unspoken. He told him about the old days, about the winds that howled across the desert at night, about missions where silence was survival. He told him things he'd never say to anyone else. To Tom, it was a ritual as natural as breathing. To the teenagers watching from across the path, it was something else entirely. There were 4 of them, maybe 5, barely out of high school, still wrapped in the kind of arrogance that believes it knows everything and fears nothing. They watched from a distance at first, chuckling among themselves. But then one of them, a lanky boy with a baseball cap turned backwards, pulled out his phone. "Check this out," he muttered, angling the camera toward Tom. The screen glinted as it caught Tom's weathered profile in Sergeant's still form. "This crazy old guy thinks his mutt is talking back." They zoomed in, catching Tom's slow nods, the way he seemed to listen as much as he spoke, the way his hand, calloused and trembling slightly with age, brushed over the dog's ear with a kind of reverence their world didn't understand. They added captions, bold and cruel. "Real people don't talk to dogs, you crazy old man. When your therapist has 4 legs and no degree." The laughter that followed was sharp and hollow, like breaking glass. It cut through the peaceful hum of the morning. jarring and cold. Tom heard them. Of course he did, but he didn't react, not the way they expected. He didn't turn to scold or defend himself. He didn't rise in outrage or shame. Instead, he leaned in just a little closer to Sergeant, lowering his voice into the kind of whisper Abba meant only for two hearts bound by years of survival. Whatever he said, no one else would ever hear it. It belonged only to them. Moments later, the park manager approached, mid-40s, uncomfortable in a tight-fitting park-issued polo, clutching a clipboard like it might protect him from whatever confrontation was about to unfold. His smile was polite, but strained. Mr. Granger, he started, voice cautious, eyes darting toward the group of snickering teens still recording. Tom looked up, eyes calm beneath the brim of his weathered cap. Yes? We've had some concerns about your behavior. My behavior? Tom repeated, his tone neutral. He didn't bristle or raise his voice. It wasn't a challenge, just a question. The manager cleared his throat. Yes, sir. Some of the park visitors, well, they're uncomfortable. You know, the whole talking to yourself thing, especially around children, it's unsettling for some. Tom glanced down at Sergeant, who opened his clouded eyes and blinked slowly, his ears twitching at the sound of tension. I'm talking to my bow, Tom said quietly, as I have every day. There was no sarcasm, no bitterness, just the plain truth. The manager hesitated, then took a small step back, trying to smile. Of course, it's just maybe that kind of thing would be better done at home. Tom's hand moved gently over Sergeant's side, brushing fur that was once thick and full, now thinned with age. No trouble, he murmured. We'll be on our way. He stood slowly, bones protesting every inch of movement. Sergeant, stiff from arthritis, took longer, his legs wobbling beneath him as he rose. Tom didn't rush him. He just waited, silent and steady, as Sergeant finally straightened with a soft grunt. Together they walked away from the bench, from the stairs, from the laughter echoing behind them. Together, just like always. Tom shuffled away from the stairwell, where the whispers and faint laughter still clung to the air like cold mist. A soldier and his battle brother, misunderstood maybe, but never defeated. Behind them the sneers were fading, swallowed by the wind, irrelevant. And ahead there was something stirring. Something quiet but powerful, like the universe itself hadn't closed the book on them just yet. Because real loyalty, true, tested, unshakable loyalty, never retreats, never gives up, never walks away. The letter arrived on a Wednesday. No knock on the door, no courtesy call, no compassion. Just an envelope, plain, white, unmarked except for his name, left dangling from the rusted mailbox bolted crookedly to Tom Gers's aging apartment door. It swayed slightly with each breath of wind, like even the paper hesitated to deliver what it carried. Inside, black ink on standard paper. Cold words typed with surgical detachment. A single sheet that cut deeper than any battlefield wound. Eviction notice, violation of pet policy, failure to provide proper documentation. No appeal, no discussion. Tom read it once, then again. His brow knit tighter with every word, his jaw clenched so hard it ached. It didn't matter that Sergeant, his dog, his companion, his war brother, had stared down death itself in the desert and saved American lives. It didn't matter that Tom had filed the paperwork, not once but repeatedly, documenting Sergeant's military service, the honors he'd earned, the shrapnel still buried in his hind leg. It didn't matter that Sergeant wasn't just not to Tom and not to anyone who'd served beside them. He was a soldier, a veteran, a survivor, but buried deep inside some government drawer, probably beneath half-eaten donuts and forgotten memos. Their story had been reduced to a missing checkbox. Their loyalty, a casualty of cold, uncaring systems. Sergeant let out a low grunt and settled his head gently on top of Tom's boot, his warm eyes glancing up with quiet understanding. Tom exhaled slowly, long and tired. He folded the letter, creased it with deliberate fingers, and tucked it into the inner pocket of his worn jacket. We've faced worse, boy, he murmured. Much worse. The apartment had never been grand, just another peeling, government-subsidized complex set aside for aging veterans. But it had been enough. It was shelter, It was theirs. 5 years of quiet days and slower mornings. It was where they healed in ways the VA never could. Now they had 30 days to disappear. No leniency, no exception. Just get out. Tom had no family to call. His brothers from the Corps were scattered now, some consumed by time, others by shadows too heavy to name. His pension barely covered the basics: a roof, groceries, sergeant's rising medical costs. There was no safety net, no rainy day fund, just the slow, constant reality of living on the edge. So he sold what little he had, his old record player, the vintage maps he'd once used to teach his grandnephew about terrain, the framed unit photo that made him tear up every time. He bartered and bargained until he scraped together enough to buy an RV, ancient, dented, sputtering, but with four wheels and a stubborn engine. Freedom, however fragile. He drove it out of the city limits, away from sidewalks and sneers and forms that forgot him. He found a spot by an old lake, half forgotten, tucked between whispering pines and low brush. They had trained there once, years ago, when Sargent was still learning hand signals and Tom's knees didn't creak with every step. It had been hot then, dust in their teeth, purpose in their bones. Now it was quiet, cool, and still. Perfect. He parked the RV beneath the trees and began again. A rough life, sure, but real. Every morning, Tom walked the lake's edge with Sargent hobbling at his side. Both of them older now, slower, but still in sync, still standing. Every evening, he lit a fire in the pit he built by hand with river stones and read aloud under a blanket of stars, his voice steady even when the words trembled. There were no neighbors to mock him now, no teenagers snickering at the old guy with the mutt. No one called Sargent a pet. Here, there were only the nightbirds, the rhythm of the water, and the soft, loyal breaths of the Ma who'd never, not once, left his side. The world had looked away. The system had erased them with a keystroke. But Tom and Sargent knew what they had. They knew what mattered. No eviction notice could undo it. No clipboard bureaucrat could define it. No viral moment of ridicule could shake it. Because home isn't four walls and a lease. It's a bond. It's a promise. It's a vow made in the dirt and dust of war and kept through years of silence. And here, beside the lake, in the stillness of a world that moved too fast to notice them, they had never been more at home. It was a promise sealed in blood and forged in battle. Loyalty that was raw, weathered, stubborn to its core. The kind that refused to break, even when everything else did. And together they would defend it until the bitter end. The first real chill of the season had crept in overnight, quiet and merciless. The kind of cold that gnawed through thin metal and old insulation like a blade. Tom Granger stirred awake in his beat-up RV, his breath curling in the dim morning light like smoke from a dying fire. He shivered, groggy, then turned, his instincts guiding him to check on Sargent, and froze. The day we stood down. His dog, his brother in arms, was curled on the floor, shuddering uncontrollably. Sargent's limbs spasmed in short, helpless jerks, and his once alert, defiant eyes were clouded, glazed over with a kind of pain Tom didn't have a name for. A low, broken sound slipped from Sargent's throat, half whimper, half sigh. The sound of a warrior too proud to cry out, but too tired to keep pretending he wasn't hurting. Something clamped down hard on Tom's chest, tighter than fear in a firefight, colder than the air around him. He dropped to the floor and gently gathered the trembling body into his arms. Sargent felt impossibly light now, fragile. The strength that once carried both of them through deserts, firefights, and years of silence was barely a memory in Tom's arms. He didn't bother with socks or coffee, just staggered barefoot into the freezing morning and yanked the RV door open. The air stabbed at his lungs, but he didn't care. He climbed into the driver's seat, Sargent bundled on the passenger side, and turned the key with trembling fingers. The engine groaned and coughed a plume of smoke before lurching awake. Tom slammed it into gear and pulled onto the road, white-knuckled and breathless. He didn't remember the drive, only the loop in his mind. Hold on, boy. Please hold on. When they reached the clinic, Tom all but fell through the door, clutching Sargent close to his chest. The receptionist glanced up briefly, unimpressed. She couldn't have been older than 25. Please, Tom rasped. His voice cracked around the word. He needs help. I don't have much money, but I'll work it off. Anything. Please, and she clicked a few keys with mechanical detachment. Payments required up front, she said flatly, as if reading it off a cue card. If you can't pay, there's a shelter across town. They offered alternative services. It took Tom a moment to register what alternative services meant. Euthanasia, a business sanitized word for death when the balance sheet came due. I'm not trying to put him down, he whispered. His voice barely made it past his lips. I'm trying to save him. I'm sorry, sir. That's policy. Policy. That word hit harder than any round he'd ever taken. Tom called it something else, betrayal. His legs gave out beneath him, and he sank into a worn-out vinyl chair in the waiting room. Sergeant trembled quietly in his lap, his breathing shallow and uneven. Tom's hands, calloused, knotted from years of war and work, moved gently through the dog's fur, trying to offer comfort, trying to offer something. He didn't cry. He hadn't cried in years, not when his closest brothers were buried beneath foreign soil, not when medals were pinned to his chest like apologies for things that couldn't be undone. But now, in a sterile waiting room that smelled of antiseptic and apathy, his heart cracked, silently and completely, under the weight of helplessness. Some people glanced at him, a few with pity, most with indifference. A teenager across the room recognized him, probably from one of those viral videos. Old vet goes off on someone, salutes his dog, talks to ghosts of war. The boy lifted his phone and started filming again, stealthy but not stealthy enough. Tom didn't look up. Let the world mock him. The only audience that ever mattered was fading in his arms. That night, they were back in the RV, the space colder than ever, shadows long and sharp. Tom crushed the last of Sergeant's pain meds into his water bowl, stirring gently until the powder dissolved. It wasn't enough to fix anything, but it dulled the sharp edges. He wrapped Sergeant in his old Marine Corps jacket, one that had seen more dust and death than it ever should have, and sat beside him on the floor. He pulled a battered paperback from his bag, its corners curled from years of reading, and began reading aloud, softly, like he had in the barracks during thunderstorms, when bombs rattled windows and fear slithered into the cracks. You stayed with me when no one else could, Tom murmured, his voice almost lost beneath the groaning wind outside. It's my turn now, boy, my turn. Outside, the wind slammed against the RV's battered shell like an enemy desperate to get in. But inside, a different kind of fight was happening. A quieter one, a more sacred one. Inside, loyalty kept vigil beside a flickering life, refusing to let the flame go out alone. Because real loyalty doesn't end when the war is over. Sometimes that's when it begins. The weight of the morning was heavier than any battlefield Tom Granger had ever crossed. The world had stopped watching, but the silence left behind was deafening. Outside, the old RV sat still under a thick, slate-gray sky, its chipped paint dulled by cold mist. Inside, time had slowed. Tom sat on the worn vinyl floor, his back pressed against a cabinet, holding Sergeant's frail body gently against his chest. The dog's breathing was shallow, each exhale a delicate rattle, as if life were slipping through a sieve. Tom's voice trembled, barely louder than the wind outside, as he whispered stories into Sergeant's soft, tattered ear. Tales of deserts, wide rivers, and nights under endless stars. They were stories of their youth, of missions no one else would ever know, and of brotherhood forged beyond the battlefield. He wasn't just telling them for comfort. He was trying to keep Sergeant tethered to this world just a little longer. But beyond the thin RV walls, the internet had already moved on to its next spectacle. The second video had gone viral overnight. More ridicule, more sneering laughter at the crazy old man who sat talking to his dying mutt. Comments poured in, cruel and thoughtless. Words from people who had never stood for anything more serious than their Wi-Fi signal strength. They didn't know. They didn't care to. But not everyone laughed. On the other side of town, within a quiet office at a Marine Corps base, a man named Bennett watched the same video. A master sergeant, long retired from the field but never far from its memory, sat in silence. The sight of Tom Granger didn't make him laugh. It rooted him still. Because Bennett didn't just see a frail man with a dying dog. He saw a Marine. He saw the title sergeant and all the weight that word had ever carried. He remembered the oaths made in the dirt, the promises shouted through gunfire, the quiet understanding that brothers didn't get left behind. Ever. Less than 3 hours after the video caught fire online, a black government SUV rolled out of the base gates. Its chrome plates glinted faintly under the heavy sky. No sirens, no flashing lights, just silent purpose. It arrived at the lakeside with surgical precision. The engine idled low as 5 Marines stepped out, their movements unified by discipline and a kind of reverence. Leading them was Master Sergeant Bennett, followed by Lieutenant Parker, Corporal Rose, Lance Corporal Jackson, and Private First Class Ellis. Each wore full dress blues, every ribbon aligned, every polished shoe reflecting the pale morning light. Their medals caught the air's shimmer like stars breaking through clouds. Inside the RV, Tom barely noticed the knock. He opened the door slowly, Sergeant still cradled in his arms like a child. The cold slapped him first, then the sight. 5 Marines standing tall, back straight, eyes fixed. "Mr. Tom Granger," Bennett said, voice firm but filled with something deeper. Respect. Memory. "Sir," Lieutenant Parker stepped slightly forward. "We're here for you and Sergeant." Tom blinked, his body aching with confusion and fatigue. "I don't understand," he murmured. "You shouldn't have to," Bennett answered simply. "You served your country, you protected your brother, and you never left him. Not even now." And then without another word, the 5 Marines snapped into a flawless salute. Not for the public, not for applause, for Tom. For the Tom who had stood beside him in silence, through war and loneliness, through missions and now decline. Sergeant had served too, in his own way no less honorable. Tom's spine straightened, his eyes clearer now. He returned the salute slowly with the dignity of a man who knew what it meant. Knew what it key. There was no mockery here, no harsh laughter, only the echoing stillness of recognition, of loyalty honored, of sacrifices seen, of time's weight acknowledged. For the first time in what felt like forever, Tom Granger didn't feel invisible. He didn't feel forgotten. He felt seen. He felt like he had come home. The ride to Bethesda Naval Veterinary Hospital passed like a dream. Inside the black SUV, wrapped carefully in a wool blanket, Sergeant rested his head on Tom's lap. The Marines rode in silence, their presence a calm buffer against the cold. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Tom kept one hand gently resting on Sergeant's side, feeling the shallow rise and fall, holding on while there was still something to hold. The kids didn't need stories of war or speeches about sacrifice. They simply sat on the porch, sometimes in awe, sometimes in silence, and watched Sergeant thump his tail, acknowledge their presence with a blink or a low wag. Slowly, the distance the world had once placed between Tom and everyone else began to close. Neighbors who had once walked by without a word now stopped to chat. Some brought homemade pie, others offered to mow the lawn or fix a fence. They didn't pity him, they respected him. They respected what he had endured, what he had protected, and the quiet strength that never asked for recognition but earned it anyway. The porch became a place of connection. Veterans came, some alone, others with their own service dogs. They shared quiet nods, war stories whispered between sips of coffee, or sometimes just sat in the stillness of knowing. One of them brought an old gidam and strummed soft melodies that floated over the lake. Another, a woman who had served in Afghanistan, started volunteering at a local school inspired by Tom and Sergeant's story. Tom still carried the memories. Those didn't vanish. The smell of desert sand, the high-pitched whine before an explosion, the brothers who didn't come home. But now those memories lived beside new ones, softer, lighter, filled with warmth. Like the time a little girl from down the road brought Sergeant a handmade scarf stitched with tiny paw prints. Or the day an entire 5th grade class showed up, lined up by the sidewalk with thank you notes and drawings in hand. Sergeant grew stronger each week. The limp faded to a slight shuffle. He'd follow Tom to the lake's edge, eyes alert, tail up. Sometimes, when the wind caught just right and rustled the trees, Tom would swear he saw the dog's ears perk like they used to, ready for orders, eager to serve. The bond between them remained unspoken, but deeply rooted. There were no commands, no whistles, just a glance, a shift of posture, and they understood each other. War had shaped them both, scarred them in ways no one else could see, but it had also fused something unbreakable between them. They were soldiers, survivors, and more than that, they were each other's safe place. The porch became a sanctuary not only for them, but for anyone who needed to believe that healing was possible, that not all endings were sad, and not all broken things stayed broken. On some evenings, the sun would set in a blaze of pink and orange, and Tom would quietly read aloud from the books he never had time to enjoy before. Sergeant would lay with his head on Tom's boot, still and content. The old rhythm of breath, now steady, now strong. Time passed, not in great sweeping waves, but in gentle ripples, the kind that lapped quietly against the shore. And in those ripples, Tom found something he never thought he'd feel again. Peace, not the fragile peace of forgetting, but the kind born from acceptance, from knowing that you did right by the ones who stood beside you in the darkest moments. So each morning, the ritual continued. Black coffee, the sound of birds, the creak of the porch swing, and the soft, ever-present breath of a dog who had once saved lives and was now, in a different way, saving his. Tom Granger, once dismissed as a crazy old man, was no longer alone. He had his brothers, his neighbors, the children, the veterans. And above all, he had Sergeant. And that, he knew deep in his bones, was enough. She knelt beside them with a gentle smile, her voice soft and steady, as she showed the children how to approach Sergeant. Her hands, weathered yet tender, guided theirs until they felt the quiet strength of beneath his fur. Not just a dog, but a living testament to duty and devotion. The children, eyes wide with wonder, followed her lead carefully. One afternoon, a boy no older than 7 looked up with innocent awe and asked, "Is he a superhero?" Tom Granger let out a low, warm chuckle, his voice carrying the weight of memory and affection. He reached over and scratched behind Sergeant's ear, a spot worn familiar over the years. "No, son," he replied, his tone gentle, almost reverent. "He's just a Marine like me." But in that answer there was more truth than modesty. Word of Tom and Sergeant's bond traveled far beyond the dusty borders of their quiet town. Veterans, men and women from every branch, from wars long past and those still raw in memory, made pilgrimages, detouring on cross-country drives just to stop at Tom's porch. They left behind tokens of unspoken respect: military challenge coins, embroidered patches, medals faded with time, handwritten notes folded with care and tucked beneath smooth stones. Each offering said, "We understand." Some stayed. They shared coffee and silence, or stories that only someone like Tom could truly receive. Others didn't need to speak at all. They stood at a respectful distance, their eyes misty, saluted the pair, the old Marine and his faithful partner, then turned and walked away, somehow lighter than when they arrived. Back at the park, the one where Tom had once endured the sting of ridicule, something quietly extraordinary happened. No ceremony, no press, just a small bronze plaque affixed beside the old wooden bench beneath the sycamore tree. It simply read, "In honor of military working dogs and their handlers, loyalty beyond words." Tom visited only once after that. Sergeant walked beside him, his gait slower now, joints stiff from the years. They didn't need to sit. Tom stood quietly, one hand resting on Sergeant's back. He didn't linger. He didn't speak. He had made his peace, and it was enough. The world hadn't been forced to change. It had shifted gently, imperceptibly, because a stubborn, quiet bond had refused to be erased. And slowly, without asking permission, it had made people remember. As the seasons passed, Sergeant aged with quiet dignity. His steps grew slower, his naps stretched longer. Tom saw the signs. He never tried to deny them. Their time was drawing to a close, not in despair, but in the natural rhythm of things. But some legacies weren't bound to time. They were written in the lives they touched, in the small dignities reclaimed, in the principles held on to when it would have been easier to let them go. One evening, as the sun melted behind the edge of the lake, casting everything in golden hush, Sergeant raised his muzzle and let out a long, low howl. It wasn't a cry of pain, it was remembrance. Echo, a final call into the wind that said, "I was here, we were here." Tom placed his hand on Sergeant's back. Steady, present. There were no words. There didn't need to be. Some promises, once made, don't vanish with age. They echo through time, through silence, through every quiet act that honors what came before. Some heroes don't march or roar. They walk with a limp. They sleep more than they used to. But they remain heroes to the very last breath. Tom understood this. He knew that Sergeant's story, their story, would endure long after paw prints faded and voices quieted. Because true loyalty doesn't die. It roots itself in memory, passed on in hushed reverence from one generation to the next. In a world that spins faster by the day, where loyalty is often dismissed as outdated and sacrifice goes unnoticed, the story of Tom Granger and Sergeant whispers a timeless truth. Real loyalty, the kind that endures laughter, hardship, even loneliness, doesn't crave applause. It doesn't shout. It stays. It holds on. It waits. And that kind of loyalty, it still matters, especially now when our elders are left behind, when generations drift apart, when values that once held communities together begin to fade like old photographs. The lesson remains: real loyalty, real honor. It's not built in grand gestures. It's forged slowly, fiercely by those who choose to stand firm when the world tells them to move on. Would you have stayed with Sergeant the way Tom did? Have you ever seen a bond like theirs between a friend, a loved one, a pet, or even a stranger? We want to know. Share your story with us in the comments. Your memories, your quiet acts of loyalty matter now more than ever. Thank you for being here, for giving this story the space it deserved. If it touched something deep inside you, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes in the quiet power of everyday heroes. Because sometimes the most important stories aren't loud. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply stay.